All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to be with us, this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Debbie Lee, and I am the communications lead at National Farmworker Ministry. I'm so glad that you've chosen to join us today for this important conversation about farm worker housing. This webinar is co-sponsored by us here at National Farmworker Ministry and the team over at Migrant Justice, which we will have a chance to hear from today. Before we dive into our speakers, I want to give you guys a heads up on how you can access one of the tools that we have available for you today. And that is our translation. So I'm going to go ahead. There are some instructions on the screen for you, but I'm going to go ahead and welcome our translators, Henry and Cesar, who are going to be helping us with translation today. Thank you so much for being with us. If you can just let everyone know how they can access these services.
Hi, yes, thank you. So I'm Henry, and I'll be one of the interpreters tonight or today, wherever you are in the country. So we will have interpretation in Spanish and in English. And if you need interpretation in English, when someone is speaking in Spanish, please select the globe icon on the bottom of your screen that says interpretation and select English to hear the English interpretation. If you are using a mobile device, please press the three dots at the bottom of your screen to see the interpretation options. And I'll be giving these instructions now in Spanish. Si necesita interpretación en español, escoja el icono de globo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla que dice interpretación o interpretation y presione Spanish para escuchar la interpretación en español. Si está usando un teléfono móvil, presione los tres puntos abajo de su pantalla para ver las opciones de interpretación. Muchas gracias. So thank you. And if you could please get the interpretation feature started, then we can begin. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go ahead and get that moving so that we can, let's take a look here. I think because I got my screen sharing that it's not letting me access that. So let me stop the share really quickly so I can make sure our translation is working. And then we can go from there. Okay, and the translation is started now. So we're going to go ahead and get back to our screen share so we can introduce all of ours. Thank you both so much for being with us today. And we're just going to go right back to the presentation. All right. So thank you again, everyone, for hanging on with us. We're working through some things. We've got an amazing lineup today for you of presenters, including a few of some people that I already know and some people that are new to me, but I know that you will love hearing from them today. Before we dive in, I want to introduce them. We've got first, we're joined by Elizabeth Rodriguez, who is the Director of Farm Worker Advocacy here at the National Farm Worker Ministry, a faith-based organization dedicated to connecting people of faith and conscience to the farm worker movement for social, economic, and racial justice. Next, we are pleased to welcome Daniela Dwyer, who is Director of Litigation with DNA People's Legal Services, a nonprofit legal aid organization that provides free civil legal services to low-income individuals who otherwise could not afford an attorney. And they're particularly since 1967, they've served remote areas across 3 states and 7 Native American nations. Next, of course, we have our friends at Migrant Justice, our co-sponsoring organization. Abel Luna is joining us. He's the head of education and outreach at Migrant Justice. And Migrant Justice works to build the voice, capacity, and power of the immigrant farm worker community in order to organize for economic justice and human rights. They do this through leadership development and collective action, bringing people together to identify shared challenges and create systemic change. And finally, we are joined by Ramon and Jorge, who are both from Farm Worker Housing Development. Ramon Martinez is Communications and Advocacy Coordinator there, and Jorge is the Head of Programs and Leadership. And they're dedicated to building safe, affordable housing until every farm worker in Oregon has a secure place to call home. Thank you all so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your attendance. We're going to go ahead and dive right in with our first presenter, Elizabeth, who will be sharing with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it right on over to Elizabeth. I'll turn my camera off so you can pay attention to her as she shares with us some background on what farm worker housing looks like today.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad that everybody is here with us today. So very quickly, I'm going to just go over who farm workers are in America. According to the Department of Labor, U.S. employs 2.4 million in agriculture. These workers work on farms. Not yet, W. Go back to the previous ones. These workers work on farms, packing sheds, ranches. They work with crops and livestock. The products of their work extend and are used by so many industries. Farm workers, they don't just feed the nation, they provide the materials that are needed to manufacture products that we use daily: clothes, medicine, everyday use products. So I would like for that to resonate with us, how important farm workers, their labor is to our own well-being. 68% of the farm worker workforce is foreign born. 38% of them lack work permits, which means that they don't have a work permit to work legally in America. These workers, they travel and work throughout the US, serving as the backbone for a $1 trillion agricultural industry. You can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Within that population, 12% of farm workers are H2A. Last year in 2024, Department of Labor reported that over 310,676 H2A visas were issued for that year. In addition, there's 6,000 more that were approved to start the 2025 year. 15% identify as migrants, which means that they move from one location to another following the crop season. Many of the farm workers are settled agricultural workers working year-round on farms, ranches with livestock, such as dairy workers. So according to Department of Labor, about in 2024, the ratio of men to women employed in agriculture is 66% men to 34% women. Thank you so much. Okay, now additional barriers that farm workers face both on the work side and or getting employment and in housing is that they have a lack of education. They have limited literacy skills. Some farm workers in some states, they don't get paid hourly. They are paid by the amount that they produce, what they harvest. This is called the piece rate system, and many don't qualify for overtime, although there are states that have already begun to advance that policy, and there are about 5 states that offer farm workers overtime now, but they do face significant barriers when it comes to not just their employment, but also when they're seeking housing. If we can move on. Thank you so much. When it comes to farm worker housing, there's not a lot of data out there. We know that there is a lack of government oversight on housing standards and regulations. This enables growers and other private owners to get away with providing substandard and overcrowding provide overcrowding housing. And a lot of the barriers, we've already mentioned. We're going to be talking a little bit more about this today. And so if you can move on to the next slide. The departments that regulate housing are currently saturated with investigations. This year, they're facing budget cuts. Many employees have been furloughed, so they're struggling with oversight. They struggled with oversight before. I can already imagine how they're struggling now. There are regulations. This causes for regulations to be poorly enforced. And I wanted to offer an example. In 2019, North Carolina, inspectors found 8 unregistered housing camps, which, this is only, I'm only talking about North Carolina. You can imagine, how that goes in other states as well. Many times when you're trying to reach out to farm workers, because the housing is employer provided or on employer property, access is not always allowed. Can you skip to the next slide, please? So these are some of the barriers that are the challenges in farm worker housing. They can be the majority or some of our farm workers, they depend on employer provided housing. And this housing can be close to or on property, on farms. They're mostly in isolated, hard to get areas where a worker who lacks transportation will have a hard time to access basic resources like groceries or healthcare. This rural isolation limits their access to food and to any additional resources that they might need. Overcrowding is a serious issue. Many times there's a lack of beds, or trying to fit as many people into a unit as possible. Units at times they may lack basic amenities. Sharing a restroom with multiple people is not only inconvenient, it's also unhealthy. There's lack of stoves, fridges. There's a lack of just washer dryers, basic everyday things that we need for our hygiene purposes. There's poor infrastructure, and this leads to sanitation issues. There's, often there could be pests or rodents. Many units lack basic amenities. Sharing a restroom, low income is all inconvenient and all unhealthy. Low income and employer provided housing makes workers extremely vulnerable to living in deplorable conditions. Additionally, you can move on to the next slide. Additionally, there's a lack of roads, basic utilities such as trash pickup, street lights, sewage, and other amenities that we take for granted, that are not always accessible to all. So this adds and often creates, adds on to those unsanitary conditions. Farm workers who are on their own, who are seeking to rent or buy, encounter additional barriers, such as struggling with the cost of living, lack of a social security number when requested or needed for some applications, low or no credit established, which leaves them in similar situations as before, struggling to keep up with the cost of living and creating a safe and secure space for themselves and their families. So today, we're going to continue to learn more, not just about farm workers and their living conditions. We're going to learn from each one of our guests how they've remedied that in their areas, or how they're calling attention to that. But also, we're going to learn a little bit more about policies and the struggles with housing issues with farm workers. So with that, I'll leave it and so that Dudley can introduce our next guest.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate your time and giving us some background on this. I think that it's really important. I think sometimes we don't even realize how much of an impact somebody's living arrangement can have on their work, what they access, things like that. And so thank you so much for shedding some light on that. Next up, we've got Daniela, who's the director of litigation at DNA People's Legal Services. And she's going to share a little bit more with us about the legislative piece, the regulations that are in place. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for the invitation to speak on this extremely important topic. Let me just get my slides going here. Okay, so I am a careerist, legal aid advocate, and it's been my privilege to represent migrant and seasonal workers in a number of different parts of the country. And one of the unfortunate things about that is that it's universal, that the housing is in short supply and of very poor quality. And there are lots of different discriminatory, sociological, economic reasons for that. But I will also say that there has been some very good advocacy, both at government and union level, as well as at legal aid levels, to try and increase the number of rights that various kinds of farm workers have in housing or to housing, and to improve the conditions which they're provided, especially as the housing stock ages over time. So this is actually a topic that we at our legal aid farm worker conventions that we do every 2 years cover in many hours. And I'm going to try and give you a crash course in about 10 minutes. And in fact, I need to start my timer here because I could go on and on. But I'm going to give you an overview. And I see here also that we have people from a lot of states in which I've represented workers. New Jersey, which probably has the best housing out of the other folks who are logged in here. North Carolina, about behind New Jersey, not terrible. And then Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia, which have very, very few state protections. So what I'm going to discuss is going to be very general and largely federal. I will point out why it's important to know what state protections there are in your jurisdictions if they exist, and really why it's just important that you be able to issue spot questions or concerns about housing and then know to whom to reach out so that they can give you a much more technical analysis about people's rights. So Liz covered part of this, but who are migrant farm workers? When I said I represented migrant and seasonal farm workers, that's a distinction in particular in the law that applies federally, called the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act. The Department of Labor calls that the MISPA, MSPA, and we farm worker advocates call that the Agricultural Worker Protection Act. But the point is that there's a federal law that provides rights for housing conditions to migrant workers if migrant workers are offered housing. So I'm not talking about the H-2A context right now. We'll address that in a moment. But if you are a migrant worker, someone who cannot commute back and forth from your job, so not a local worker, someone who's settled out, then you can ask that housing be provided. It's not a right. But if it is provided by the employer or provided by a third party, because this can be provided by any person, it doesn't have to be an employer in order to be regulated. But if it is provided, it needs to meet certain federal standards. Seasonal workers, people who are local, they don't migrate, but nonetheless work in agriculture, don't have housing condition rights coverage unless for some reason they're living in the housing. But it's also important to know that once you are in the housing, you have to meet all of the federal, the state, the local requirements. And this applies also for people who are children. So a lot of the cases that we have handled have been on behalf of migrant farm worker children who are US citizens and therefore eligible for legal aid services, or family members, significant others who might not be working but are there taking care of their children and also enjoy those protections. So the first question is, what kind of worker are you talking about? Are they migrant or seasonal? Do they have a visa? Because there are some laws that apply generally, and there are others that are very particular to the kind of visa or jurisdiction that the person is in. I'm going to gloss over this a little bit because Liz covered a lot, but there are obviously a lot of issues that make it difficult for farm workers to find housing. The median age of a farm worker right now is about 38, but if you're talking about the H-2A program, it's much, much lower. I'd say it's probably around 21 or 22. This says about 68% men, and that's getting reflected more and more in the use of barracks housing, which we'll talk about, especially since the H-2A program is primarily men. Many people who are doing farm work right now are foreign born, about 60% born in Mexico, so they don't necessarily have a sense of what American rights are, period. or concepts of anti-retaliation, much less what their particular rights are in a certain state or locality. And a lot of folks, as Liz said, are people that are not native English speaker, many of whom are Spanish speakers, and many of whom speak indigenous languages as well. Plus, we have a lot of different family dynamics, whether or not they're all living in the same housing. We have people who are married but may or may not bring their family. Here in South Texas, where I'm presenting from, we used to have quite a lot of Texans that would travel up and down the East Coast migrant stream or to the Midwest. And as family housing has grown in shorter supply and been replaced by barracks, you have fewer of that. And many folks don't have access to healthcare, so the right to safe and dignified housing once you're in the housing is really important. So why is farm worker housing an issue? Well, let me give you some examples of farm worker housing. As I said, what I've seen the uptrend in, especially as the H2A program grows and grows, is in the use of barracks. So these are high occupancy, single sex buildings. Sometimes it's a motel that used to operate as a motel, but has been completely bought out by a housing operator, sometimes the grower and employer, sometimes a third party. And what used to be very small motel rooms are now converted into rooms with bunk beds, and they're pushed very close together. Because they're bunk beds and people are sharing rooms, it's usually single occupancy, and people do have a right to personal space so that they have a place to put their personal effects and for food storage, but it's a very small locker. And there's often just one kitchen or a central mess and shared showers and bathrooms. Under federal law, there are a certain number of showers and bathrooms that need to be present for capacity. And so if you're talking about the applicability of the Agricultural Worker Protection Act, which does not apply to H2As, but applies to other agricultural workers, the ratio is roughly one bathroom, meaning one toilet and one shower per 15 people, which is really, really low if you're talking about, dignity and usability. As people mentioned, there are different kinds of housing, and where the housing is located has tremendous impact on the rights and the barriers that people have. So this is an example of on-farm housing, housing that's located on employer property. And any person who provides agricultural worker housing under the Agricultural Worker Protection Act, whether or not they are the employer or whether or not they are a farm, are covered by that act. But not many people know what their obligations are, and not many workers do either. So this is an example of some farm labor housing where people were living in a camper, and you can see that they have some way in which they're washing their clothes and drying them, but it's also adjacent to a field, which makes it very difficult for their health, especially when pesticides are sprayed or when pests come out of the fields and go into people's housing, especially when they have things like broken windows that are located there in that camper. There are other kinds of rules, federal and state, that apply to hotels or motels. And as far as the federal law is concerned, what's really important to know about that housing is who owns or controls the housing. So there are some places that operate as motels or hotels, and they have other regular people, for lack of a better word, tourists, travelers who stay at the hotel, and they call themselves a public accommodation and say that they are exempt from federal or state regulations as farm labor housing because they have people who are non-farm workers who live there. But the real important question on a factual basis is, are they provided that housing on equal terms? So for example, we had a number of farm workers who were in the Midwest who would stay at a Quality Inn or, the Sleep Inn, not to besmirch those particular brands, but they're generally like the 1-star or barely 1-star places, but they were put in a building that was completely separate, a building that wasn't maintained. They were not given maid service. They were not allowed to use the breakfast. They were only given one key card per room, and they paid their rent if they were charged for the housing, not H2As. Housing should be free, but if they were charged for the housing as non-H2As, they would pay the rent to a farm labor contractor or to their employer, and then the hotel would receive the money. So completely different terms than public accommodations, which we would argue means that they then function as farm labor housing and should meet those standards. Also, we have mobile homes, and mobile homes could be on the property of an employer or a third party who's providing them, or they could just be in a neighborhood mobile home park that's completely off-site, but has a lot of farm workers in it. And in each jurisdiction, states as well as localities have started developing regulations and laws that apply to mobile homes, some of which include the rights of mobile home occupants, but some of which also involve housing codes and safety codes that people who live there, especially if they have title to the unit, must abide by. And so it's often a delicate balance to deal with the health department or local code enforcement to get them to lay off workers who don't necessarily have the money to fix or the right of control or title to be able to fix things, but are living in really bad conditions that really should be fixed. So, mobile homes, especially if they're off property, are a pretty unique situation that have a whole set of their own regulations. Sometimes you have housing like this, if you want to call it that. These were railroad car shipping containers that we found workers living in West Texas near the Van Horn area. And the housing was so bad that prior to them putting workers in that housing, they housed ostriches in there, and the hay and the ostrich poop was still in there. That was literally the only quote unquote furnishings that were in there. This was an unlicensed property that we ended up reporting to the Department of Labor and representing US workers in private litigation, civil litigation against the employer for housing issues as well as wage issues. And this is an inside example of the shipping container in which people had just made their own makeshift housing. That gray board in the back is actually an abandoned door that's on a monster truck tire. And that was the person's mattress and box spring, which is not the mattress and box spring that's required in the federal housing regs under the Migrant and Seasonal Protection Act, Agricultural Worker Protection Act, nor is it lawful to have a propane gas grill as your cooking kitchen inside the shipping container. But given that they had very few other facilities, this was a place that did have a barracks, but was more a storage place before they put workers in it with a bunch of abandoned junk and property. And there were way more workers on the inside of the barracks, including those who were using the kitchen that was filled with flies, than could really be held in the building. And so that's when workers started living in these other outbuildings, which the farm labor contractor was aware of and didn't try and improve in any way before we sued. So as I said, it's important to know what kind of housing you're talking about, where it's located. There are some federal protections under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, that's the OSHA. And depending upon the date of construction of the housing, so it's important to know that too, there are regulations that apply under the OSHA or regulations that apply under the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Act. So if the housing was constructed before or after April of 1983, when the Agricultural Worker Protection Act was enforced, there are different sets of regs that vary a little bit around the margins. They largely have the same protections, but it's important to know which set of regulations you're dealing with based upon dates of construction, which you should be able to figure out if the place is a permitted place, but if not, you may need to look for information in the real property records or just historical knowledge. How long has this building been here? There are some states that have their own farm labor standards. Sadly, many of the southern states that are on the call here are not those states. New Jersey and North Carolina have them. I'm not aware of them in Kentucky, Tennessee, or Georgia. And then there are federal regulations that apply to H-2A workers that are completely separate. So there are regulations that cover all kinds of things like bed requirements, cooking facilities, sewage, whether you have a right to laundry. They're extremely limited. And in some jurisdictions, like when I used to practice in Maryland, they had a migrant camp code, but you were not required to have a flushing toilet. You could still have porta potties, which many people did, and which then created problems with the septic system because there was overcrowding and there was a lot of leakage of the septic into the water. So I'm going to speed this along a little bit, but there are a lot of common issues in hotels and motels with not enough beds and overcrowding. In barracks, they don't often have AC or heating. Water and sewage issues can be a problem if there's overcrowding, and lack of real practical access to using common facilities when there are too many people to be able to access them all at the same time. You only have an hour before you need to wake up and head out the door, and everybody needs to shower and everybody needs to eat. And then you get back at 11:30 at night and you have 1 hour if you want to get many hours of sleep. So there are a lot of structural challenges to enforcing people's rights. We've covered those: lack of trust in the legal system, lack of alternative job opportunities, family dynamics, especially if you have other family members that are working there and you're afraid of retaliation. And for H-2A workers in particular, their visa is tied to the particular employer that brought them in. So if they don't work for that employer, they are no longer in lawful status. And there are retaliation provisions or protections in the H-2A regs, but it's very difficult for people to choose to exercise them for all of these reasons. So how do we enforce these various protections? Federal, state, if they exist, local, if they exist, for non-H-2A workers and H-2A workers? Well, there are private mechanisms under the Agricultural Worker Protection Act for bringing a lawsuit. A lot of legal aid programs have been able to do that. We need a client, but we've been able to do that. And there are some select private attorneys who are not legal aid attorneys, but used to be and have taken on a lot of this litigation because it's the right thing to do and needed across the country. We also develop relationships with state and federal agencies. So for example, here in Texas, we have a close relationship with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, the TDHCA, which does a lot of the pre-occupancy inspections and should do during occupancy inspections in conjunction with the Department of Labor. And workers can also take matters into their own hands. The example here is a sick out or complaining collectively about things, but we have to be aware that the federal union law, the National Labor Relations Act, unfortunately has a very nasty carve out, meaning it's not applicable to agricultural workers. And so you need to look to states, the few states like in California that have agricultural labor rights under a state law. And of course, we have practical considerations. Do you have permission to make a report? When can you make the report? People are much more inclined to improve conditions while workers are there, but workers don't necessarily want to complain until they've already left for understandable reasons. So there's a lot of timing, especially in your interactions with agencies. So that was a huge overview. I'm sorry for going a little bit over time. I do have my contact information up here. Right now I'm working in the areas primarily of Arizona and New Mexico, but I'm more than happy to put you all in touch with people in other jurisdictions all across the country. We have a very tight network of legal aid farm worker lawyers. And I just want to conclude by thanking you all for the work that you do, especially the people who are trying to create decent housing that's not employer controlled, because it's so needed for people's dignity. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. I think the most surprising thing for me when I first came into working with a National Farm Worker Ministry has been the fact that there's so many regulations that you would think, oh, this applies to some people, but there's carve outs specifically for this population. And so that's why it's so important that we have organizations like the ones that are going to be joining us next to share to what they're doing, how it looks, when we take action. And so next up, we've got Abel from Migrant Justice that will be joining us. You want to go ahead and turn your camera on, Abel. And you're going to be sharing a little bit about what you all are doing there in Vermont. I know that Migrant Justice does a lot of work in the Northeast and throughout the country. But you're going to share a little bit about the housing experience there in Vermont, which is one of the areas that we haven't touched on yet. So I look forward to learning a little bit more about that from you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Abel, and I'm an organizer with Migrant Justice. And thank you all for inviting us. Yeah, we're gonna share a little bit about our experience when it comes to worker housing, specifically in the dairy industry. Just a little bit about Migrant Justice before we get started. It's a nonprofit organization in Vermont. Started by migrant farm workers, and to this day, it continues to be led by migrant farm workers, so people that are working in the dairy industry. And it started as a necessity after the death of a young farm worker named Jose Obed Santis Cruz from Chiapas, Mexico, just a teenager who died in a workplace accident. That was the spark to migrant justice and a spark to the conversation, not just amongst our community, but amongst consumers, those that are eating dairy products in Vermont and across the Northeast and the country, to understanding that there is migrant neighbors maintaining and sustaining some of these very famous brands of cheese and other products that we see on the shelves on the stores. But that was the beginning of migrant justice. Since then, we've been organizing again mainly with dairy workers. That changed recently after COVID. And I can get a little bit into that. Our community started to expand into other industries, and that with that came a different set of challenges for people that wanted to step outside of the farms and live outside of farm provided housing. But I'll talk about dairy provided housing and our experience there, and then we can switch over if we have time to the next part. Yeah, so migrant justice, we've done a bunch of surveys throughout, our time since we got started. And we learned about many different things. I'm going to, and you guys can go into migrantjustice.net. There's the results of all the different surveys that we got done throughout the years. I'm going to be talking specifically about, 2024, a newer survey and, all the other issues that we're seeing. So we ran a survey 2024, about 212 workers were part of it. 82% of the workers that were surveyed, reported having housing issues one way or another. With that, 49% reported, safety concerns. For example, no locks in the rooms, no locked in the housing, people coming in and out anytime at night, people that don't live in the house. No privacy, no alarms or no working alarms, lack of fire extinguishers. And it has happened where, you're asleep and the house catches on fire and you don't know that is happening. People losing property and all of that. 30%, reported, lack of privacy, structural problems with the housing. Meaning I think we got to see some of the pictures. It's not very different from what we see here in Vermont. People that have there's huge holes in the walls, huge holes in the floor, leaking roofs, leaking toilets, leaking everything. Water sometimes running in the kitchen, and the solution. For the majority of that is just to put a piece of plywood on top or put a piece of plastic on top, and that is what people have to deal with. There's a 20% reported having insufficient heating or not enough insulation in the house. So meaning there might be heaters in the property or in the housing, but they're not working or they're breaking pretty often. There becomes an issue. We're talking about Vermont. It gets really cold, negative 10, 20, 30. So you have, you can imagine what people are dealing with when the heat goes off in the winter. The housing is old on the majority of the farms where people are working and living. Housing it's old. Housing is pretty drafty. There's not enough insulation to keep the house warm, so that's another issue. Overcrowded housing conditions. Near 15% of people that were surveyed reporting, living with 3 people per room. That means that sometimes you have multiple shifts in a single farm, and people, are waking up as they're asleep because somebody's coming in, somebody's leaving to their work shift or, coming back for lunch. So there's really no privacy there. You can't really get a full rest. That has a lot of other health issues. Just I was visiting a worker last night. We were talking about this, and he shared, in the farm where he was working, there was 15 people living in a single trailer that was meant only for 6 people. So you can imagine 15 people sharing a single bathroom, sharing an entire trailer. And the solution for the farmer was to just make, makeshift rooms out of plywood, really tiny spaces where workers will just sleep. And that was the solution. Drinking water is also a problem. There's no drinking water because it has a lot of chemicals and other stuff. Both farmers and farm workers are facing the same issue. Those are just some numbers from the survey. I think I want to make clear that in Vermont, when we're talking about the dairy workers, you're sleeping or you're living in the same property that you're working, year round. So people are staying in the farm, living in the farm, and that creates, a lot of different power dynamics. I think, we heard from a couple of people, this fear of complaining of retaliation. If you speak up, you can get kicked from the job, you can get retaliated in different ways, deducing your paycheck, your hourly wages and getting kicked. Those are very real issues that people are facing in the dairy industry here in Vermont specifically. I know that those issues are also across the country, as we've heard, focusing on Vermont. And so, not unique to Vermont. I used to be a farm worker myself. I experienced those very same conditions, living with six other adults, having just 3 beds. It was a first come, first serve. If you got late from work, you probably sleeping on the floor. That is the reality that a lot of people are facing in the agricultural industry across in the dairy industry as well. And so, we have this question, what do we do? These are the things that we're facing. These are the issues that we're facing. And so the solution for those issues and many more that, we probably won't have time to get into, for workers was to build a program that will have a strong enforcement mechanism. And we called it Milled with Dignity. It's a program that was developed by workers. From workers' experience, we created a code of conduct after many years of, thinking about what will work for our experience and our reality. And so we created a program that invites big corporations to use their purchasing power to drive down change to the farms where they're buying the milk from, really, enforcing the program on those farms. So far we have seen a huge change. Ben and Jerry's. I'm sure a lot of people in this room know Ben and Jerry's. It's a huge corporation. They joined the Mill with Dignity program back in 2017, and the farms where they are, where they're buying milk from, workers are having a really different reality when it comes to housing versus those that are outside of the program. There is, person have privacy. People have their own room. There's working alarms. There's washer and dryers. For the house, you don't have to wash your clothes in the same, washer where you wash the things that you work with the cows every single day. There is a working alarms, there's fire extinguishers, there's an education, we as workers come into the farms and we do education on the program, on the rights. And so Mill with Dignity has really transformed the lives of many hundreds of people that are under the program. And really what we did was build our own Department of Labor. As we've heard, migrant workers are excluded from a lot of different, benefits, rights in the law, and so we needed to a different way out. We know that Department of Labor, Department of Housing, nothing is going to change if they they can't do anything. And so we decided to build our own program, our own Department of Labor. There's a third-party enforcing mechanism. So if people have a leaking roof, they can call the third-party, group that will come to the farmer, make a plan, and within, a week or a few days, there is a solution in place, and people, have a dignified housing. Outside of the program, their reality is very different, and people are that survey and the results come directly from farms outside of the program. And so, there's a lot of problems, but Mill with Dignity represents a solution, collective solution for the issue that we're facing. And very briefly, after COVID, our community started to expand and go into different industries, settle down roots, having families. That meant that, people don't want to be, living near the cows and breathing those toxic gases and, being there 365 days. People need to have their children in school. People need to access other services. So, people started, moving away, not completely from their industry. Majority of their industry still being work still being done by migrant workers, whether you're a small farm or super large farm. But construction industry, restaurant industry, hotel industry, are now where our community is also, working there. And as we've heard, a lot of issues where, you don't have a social security number, you probably won't have the ability to put a roof over your family's head. If you're trying to get away from these abusive conditions or housing conditions that you're facing on a farm, it's hard because if you don't have a social security number, if you're a migrant worker, if you don't speak English, there's a lot of discrimination in the housing industry outside of even outside of farms. That's been our experience. So in 2024, since 2024, we started engaging with different legislators in the state of Vermont to come up with a solution. And just this year, we passed a legislation to make sure that landlords are not discriminating against migrant community regardless of where you're from. So there is a law in place in Vermont that protects you. People cannot ask you for the social security number. It's an optional thing now. You can provide your driver license, your passport. So really, that to say that a lot of different issues that are still happening and we continue to face. But we've the only way out of that, in our experience is to organize, for people to not be afraid to speak up, and that's what Migrant Justice does. We work together as a community to empower ourselves and really look for solutions that are going to be or that are going to have an impact in our community, not just to some people, but to the wider community, regardless if you're from Mexico, Guatemala, or whatever part of the world you're from. People need to have access to housing, and so legislation and Meal with Dignity when it comes to housing have been two of the solutions to address those issues that we've seen on farms.
Thank you so much. It's so great to hear how you're tackling this, because not every state, as we learned earlier, has legislation in place or regulations that can protect farm workers. But seeing that this community has the power to make change, we've just got to be active and take steps towards that. Thank you so much for all you're doing there and all that Migrant Justice is doing towards the cause of dignifying homes for farm workers. We really appreciate that. We're going to move right along to our next presenters, which is Jorge and Ramon. They are from please tell me if I get it right. It's Farmworker Housing Development Corporation, correct? All right. So I'm going to go ahead and give it over to you, gentlemen. I know we've heard a lot about the challenges, and I know you guys are actively working to make this, to provide a solution there in Oregon. And so we'd love to hear more about the solutions you're providing in your area for farm workers to give them dignified housing options. And I'll let you take it away from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Deb, and thank you everyone for having us. And so FHDC, we're going to try to get through this presentation as quickly as we can so we can have time for questions at the end. FHDC is a nonprofit housing developer out in Western Oregon, and we're in an area called Willamette Valley. And so we've been doing our work a little over 30 years now, and we're just going to, throughout this presentation, you'll see a little bit about how we are not just focusing on housing. So although that's the foundation of our work. So this is a kind of a snapshot of where our work is done. And so at the moment we have 12 properties, but at this very moment we got 3 properties in the pipeline. We got 2 new properties that are going to be getting off the ground very shortly, and one of the properties is also getting expanded in Oregon's capital, Salem. And and within that properties, we also have community centers, community rooms, and we have an education center, And yeah, so it's really exciting to not just focus on housing, but then you'll see Jorge, my colleague, is going to talk a little bit about the services that we provide. And so we'll go. Oh, well, Jorge will take it away here in terms of how or the why FHDC was founded.
Yes, hello everyone. Buenos dias from Woodburn Oregon. So one of the things that we'd like to share about FHTC is that, okay, give me 1 second. Sorry, we're having a bit of difficulties here.
Want to move on to your housing services then?
Yeah, no. Let's. So as you can see, right on the left side of your screens on the pictures, those were the conditions of the homes that, or the living standards that farm workers were living before FHCC came into place. And so on your right-hand side, you can see that throughout the years in the history of FHTC, we have created comunidades or colonias that are able to provide a healthy environment for our families. And so with the different programs that we have at different colonias, we're able to provide services to our families and also the communities at large. And so just to highlight some of the programs that we have on site at most of the colonias, it's an asset building department. And so this is a foreclosure prevention. Hey, Ramon, I think they're not able to see the slides. I'm not sure if you're able to.
Are you able to see the slides, folks?
Yeah, so we're not seeing the presentation. We're just seeing the main slide as if you haven't scrolled through.
Interesting. Okay. I apologize. Because I'm okay. As I was rolling along. So I was.
So while Ramon gets that going for us, I'll just keep sharing some of the programs that we have on site. And so an asset building department, which we call it Camino a la Prosperidad, or Pathway to Prosperity. It is a program that helps longtime residents living at our properties to become self-sufficient and move out of affordable housing. And one way of approaching that is by doing a home ownership program. And so this is a program that helps families get ready to purchase a home. And so we do it through a counseling class. Some of the families are working on action plans to become homeowners within a year to 2 years. We also do an IDA program, which is an individual development account. And this is a program that matches their savings. So right now we have a 5-to-1 matching program. So if families are able to save, let's say $5,000, they'll get matched 5 times that amount. So they can purchase a home, or they can start their own business, or they can purchase a reliable vehicle. In addition to the homeownership part that we offer, we also do financial literacy classes for our youth and our parents. And that includes understanding budgeting, credit, and also moving forward with, sorry, we're just, moving outside of affordable housing. The other program that we have also, it's the health access. And so this programs, it's able to provide on-site clinics to our residents in the community at large where the colonias are. And so these are dental health vans are able to provide services free of charge to our families. Then we have a promotores program. This is a resident-led program that it's run by 14 promotoras. and they're the ones running most of the after school programs. So we're able to give them the training necessary for them to take the lead on running programs, as well as they get a stipend, a monthly stipend. And so it's all about wraparound services. So, we build buildings, but then we also bring social services to our residents so they can become self-sufficient. Let's do the next
All right,
slide.
perfect. And so right now, gracias, Jorge. So after this presentation, we're going to provide this link that provides an overview of our work. This was done by our friends at NowCap. So look out for that. And then I'm going to skip over this part and just for the sake of time. And so Jorge, maybe taking away in terms of our expansion.
Sure. So there's two upcoming projects. Well, there's actually four upcoming projects that we're going to be able to expand in the Willamette Valley. And so one of them, one of our newest projects is Colonia del Valle Próspero. This is in Albany, Oregon, which is a rural area as well. And so we're in the process of building 130 affordable units. And then Colonia del Valle Próspero, it's also going to have the option to offer a homeownership model to families. And so one of the options that we're still looking around at, if we want to do a land trust, which is going to make it more easier for families to afford a home, or if it's going to be just a regular mortgage. And so the other thing that I want to mention is that we do have families who are not able to get a traditional mortgage. And so we're also working with different lenders here in Oregon that are able to provide an ITIN loan. We know that those ITIN loans require a larger down payment assistance. And so that's why we're trying to put the puzzle together by offering IDAs to our families as well as different down payment assistance. The other property that we're also expanding, it's in Salem, and that's going to be an additional 54 units of affordable housing. And so it's coming along. There's also another property in Woodburn. And so it's nonstop for us. There's also challenges when it comes to affordable housing, especially here in Oregon. And so we, with our supporters and the ongoing efforts of fundraising to continue our mission, we've been lucky enough to be able to do that. Next one.
Perfect. Yep. And then just very quickly here. So FHDC initially, when it first got founded, it was being operated by a third-party property management company. And to make a very long explanation short, did not work out. And then, so approximately almost 10 years ago, FHDC was able to create this organization called Evolved Workforce, which it has two main focuses. It has the property management component. And so the property management component actually is comprised of folks who used to live in these in FHDC properties. So they're very more in tune and connected with the needs of the community. And the second part of this is a workforce component. So really helping families explore different career paths. And so it's a really it's been a very beautiful history so far, and it's next year will be 10 years in the making, and so we'll looking forward to seeing how we can grow further with that initiative. And so another part about our movement is we're not able to do this work alone here in the Mid Valley. So our work is we are connected with an organization or a network called Alianza Poder. And so this Alianza Poder network consists of organizations that are focused on leadership, legal matters, education, families, kind of more, we have county level partnerships, and we have statewide partnerships with this. And so I can provide a link for the specifics on the Alianza Poder. And that is pretty much where we leave it at. And then I'll just let Debbie take it from here.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I think it gives us all some hope to know that there's great, this organizations like yours on the way, making this possible, making, the dream of dignified housing for farm workers, making it possible, and seeing that it is possible, I think gives all of us hope that, these kind of things can come to all the states that we serve. And so while we had hoped that we would have some time for questions for everybody, we are super tight on time. We're running right up to that 2 o'clock mark for those on the East Coast. So I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us. And if you do have questions, there were some that were dropped in the Q&A, and our director of farm worker advocacy has provided some answers to those. But if you had any others, please go ahead and send them to us. We'll make sure the email address is on your screen. It's just nfwm@nfwm.org. You can send them in and we will address them. And we'll make sure you get connected to our presenters who can address them more fully for you as well. If you want to learn more about our presenters, as we mentioned, Farm Worker Housing Development, the team there did mention a video. If you go ahead and scan any of these codes on your screen, their video is actually the one that's listed for you. But we'll also include all of these links on our recap page and in the recap email that we're sending out. So if you're registered for this webinar, you will get an email that will include a replay and all of the related links as well. So thank you so much to all of you for joining. It's been a pleasure to learn about this with all of you. And then, of course, thank you kindly to everyone who joined us today, as well as our translation team for their support. The replay, we allow usually about 5 business days for that to be available. You will get an email if you're registered for this session, but you'll also find it just at nfwm.org. Thank you all so much for being with us today.